Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm Rebecca Prime, editor of Film Quarterly, and you are at Page Views Live, which is our webinar event. For each issue, we have a Page Views feature to showcase and put a spotlight on a very exciting new release in the field of film and media studies. And we are delighted to be able to today shine that spotlight on, oh, I've got my blurred screen on, Cinematic Guerillas by Jie Li. And this section we sort of think of as our online book club. And so it's really nice to see some familiar names, repeat attendees in the audience. And also the timing of today's event has proven to be very serendipitous. We didn't realize this at the time, but with the start of Chinese New Year tomorrow, it's nice to be able to have this conversation today about this very fascinating study of cinematic guerrillas in mid-century China. So to give everyone more of a introduction to the book, I'm going to hand things over to Bruno Guaraná, who is our Page Views editor, and he will introduce the book and what we'll be chatting about today. So over to you, Bruno.
Thanks, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. So it's a pleasure to be here today and to speak with Jie Li about her book. Rebecca has already kind of introduced it to you. It's called Cinematic Guerillas, Propaganda, Projectionists, and Audiences in Socialist China. What I'll do today is I'll give a brief introduction to just get you all familiarized with the book, and then I'll have a conversation with Jie Li after having had our interview published on Film Quarterly in the latest issue. I know we're all here to hear from her rather than for me, but I think it's useful to sort of level out the playing field a little bit. The book opens with a description of what I find to be a mesmerizing scene in a 1961 Chinese children's film called The Heroic Little Guerrillas. In the film, which narrates the People's Liberation Army's efforts to set Taiwan free from its ruling nationalist party, and how primary school children themselves, inspired by films about anti-Japanese guerrillas, they assisted Chinese soldiers by doing laundry, delivering water, or even catching spies. And in the film's climactic ending, an enemy bomb happens to cut off communication from Chinese headquarters, which leads 5 children to hold hands and thus reconnect the broken telephone cables by allowing the electric current to pass through their bodies as they sing a hymn. I describe this example because it serves as a very useful illustration of the central concern of the book, what Jie Li calls cinematic guerrillas. At a time following the revolution during which nation building was at stake, cinema proved to be a key tool for perpetuating the revolution and guaranteeing the survival of the socialist state. As she convincingly puts it throughout the book, the Chinese Revolution was also a media revolution. I think it's a very interesting way to see it, and very well argued throughout the book as well. By the term cinematic guerrillas, Jie refers to the human nodes in Mao's propaganda networks, like the children in the film connecting the infrastructure. These nodes include, for her, the guerrilla fighters that are celebrated in revolutionary films, like in The Heroic Little Guerillas, mobile projectionists who brought cinema and other media to remote villages across the nation, many of which didn't even have electricity, and finally, audience members who learned and employed guerrilla reception tactics. While the book is peppered with many examples of these revolutionary films and their heroes, its true focus and brilliance really is on the exhibition and reception of cinema, that is, itinerant projectionists and rural film viewers. Considering them key conduits of propaganda, many times more effectively embodying revolutionary values than did the films they projected or watched, Jie proposes a new historiography of Chinese cinema that considers the embodied practices and creative agency of both projectionists and audience members, as they actively interpreted, projected, and produced meaning embedded in the films themselves and beyond. Her organizing principle, or her organizing analogy, rather, is that of Maoist cinema as engaging in what she calls revolutionary spirit mediumship, highlighting its ritualistic and transformative function and enabling the consideration of how cinema formed the revolutionary mass, in her words, quote, transforming their perceptions of space and time, past and future. And I like how that also challenges traditional understandings of spectators as passive actors, right, in the process of cinema. So to reconsider them as active in creating and negotiating meaning. Throughout the book, while resorting to a wide range of sources such as oral history interviews with former grassroots projectionists and audience members, writings and speeches of Communist Party leaders that project specific discourses around film and media, periodicals, and the films themselves, Jie makes the compelling case that reception itself constitutes the core of cinema's function and value. So it's very hard to overstate how exciting the narrative that Jie constructs in the book really is, and how fascinating the details that she manages to excavate really are. And so I'm really happy to once again have another conversation with her about the book. So welcome, Jie. Thank you for sharing the work with us. And I guess I'll give you the opportunity to sort of restate anything that I might have missed or said perhaps not as accurately from your perspective before we get started.
Well, thank you so much, Bruno, Rebecca, also for featuring my work in Film Quarterly. It's such an honor to be part of the Page View series. And Bruno, I was also really moved to read your insightful and really generous review of my book. It was wonderful to have an opportunity to think through it after working on it for so many years. Also, thank you for everyone to everyone who's taking the time to tune in. Happy Lunar New Year. So yeah, I feel that you've already sort of given a really good encapsulation of the gist of this book. Yeah, I think maybe I can talk a little bit about how I came to work on this project. It's not exactly in the book, but I have been studying and teaching Chinese cinema, also East Asian cinema, for so many years, but there was always somewhat of a disconnect between the film texts that we were analyzing in the classroom, which tended to be quite canonical, also like art film classics by fifth generation, sixth generation directors. And then the kind of cinematic discourses, memories of my family members when I talk to them about the films that I've been teaching, or and then they talk about their memories of these propagandistic war films, or of revolutionary model opera films that were made in the Cultural Revolution, which are in some ways quite unteachable for a US classroom because they seem so obviously propagandistic. But it's way too simplistic to say that that audience was actually brainwashed by this kind of propaganda cinema. And cinema was so important for that generation. I think there was more, if you look at just the statistics of movie going from the 1950s to 1970s, the per capita movie going rate was almost like 30 films per person per year. As opposed to like today, when we talk about the Chinese box office all the time, maybe the average Chinese audience would go to a cinema once or twice a year only. So I'm thinking about this golden age of cinema and what did it mean, what cinema meant for them, especially for, I guess, my parents' generation. And I heard all these interesting stories about how they were anticipating mobile projection teams to arrive in the village, and also about projectionists who would actually censor the films that they were showing. So we also had family friends who worked as projectionists during the Cultural Revolution and talked about how the village would cook up a big feast for him every time he arrived. So it really did make me realize that cinema for them was actually not just the films, but the overall experience of going to the films, but also the projectionists themselves played an active role. So I started actually looking for accounts of film projection and receptions in various periodical gazetteers, and also interviewing people since 2012. And I also made field trips to various provinces to gather very different kinds of accounts of movie going because I realized that those in my family circles were mostly from Beijing and Shanghai. And so it was still mostly an urban experience, or maybe they were sent down to the countryside. But then what was the experience of film like in various parts of the countryside? So that's when I really did a lot of ethnographic field work for the book, to understand the experiences of cinema then.
Yeah, that's fascinating. No, and I'm glad you brought up that is actually what I was going to ask, was the origins of this project to begin with. And I just wanted to highlight one thing that you said with the per capita movie going rate, that that number includes like open air screenings, right?
Yeah.
So not necessarily tickets that are being sold, but these these collective screenings that are the focus of the book, really. And the other thing that I find truly fascinating is the centrality of the projectionists and how highly visible they were, right? Sometimes even more important, as you claim, than the films themselves, or more effective in reproducing like this model, what are they? Model revolutionary worker, right? Idea. But I wanted to then, move on to I guess the projectionists themselves, which I think are so unique in your account. And so the cover of the book, I think I was just looking at it earlier this morning more intently, gives us a lot of clues about the specifics of this film projectionist, not only because it is a woman in this case. We'll talk about women projectionists later. But what did their work entail? What were they doing in China at that time?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, maybe I can start with I actually, my own background image right here is was a contender for the color for the cover image of the book as well, because it sort of shows the projectionists and then audience members, as well as what's being projected. But of course, this is in color, and it's much more vibrant. And but I guess projectionists, there were not that many movie theaters in China, especially by the 1950s. There were only about 600 movie theaters, but many projection teams were developed in order to bring projectors, to bring cinema to rural areas that did not have, did not even have electricity. So they would be bringing not only films and projectors, but also like power generators and the screens. Everything would be set up for the most part in open air. Also because in rural areas, there's not enough public spaces that can accommodate a large audience. There would be thousands of audiences at these early screenings. And so they would be showing these outdoors. So the projectionists also have to sort of contact the local to facilitate. So there were sometimes ticketed screenings, and sometimes also they would have to also collect a fee from the local villagers. So these were actually not completely subsidized by the state. So somebody had to pay for them. So they had to also like carry the equipment with them into areas that didn't have the greatest roads. And so sometimes they took a different modes of transportation in order to get there. And because cinema was so new for audiences, especially rural audiences in the 50s and 60s, the projection also had to explain the films as they were projecting them. So actually in this background image, you can see the projectionist kind of holding a microphone, and he's probably talking about what he's projecting at the same time. There's also, because the reels that they were showing were about 10 minutes each, and then they had to rewind, right? So that each there's always a time lag between the different reels, and then there's a time for projectionists to fill the blanks by explaining what audiences had just watched, because they were a bit confused by the cinematic language at the time. So in terms of the this particular, oh, sorry.
I'll show you.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yeah. So this particular image is quite interesting because you can see that the film projectors in the background, and what she's holding, what's very prominent in the foreground, one is a slide projector. So many projectionists were also making lantern slides that were actually about local events. And they were also making explaining the films with a bamboo clapper. So sometimes the films, but also making local propaganda. So one of the tasks of model projectionists is to go to the village and find out what are the local priorities. Are there certain good people and good deeds to celebrate, and then they would actually write up little jingles or ditties, and then complement that with lantern slides that they themselves made. So that's why in some ways projectionists are also they're also artists, many of them, and they're performance artists. They're even like visual artists, and so in a local movie team, they would sometimes try to hire the best amateur or the local talents in various from various. Some of them are actually good script writers. They can write poetry, right? So many of the projectionists I interviewed, I found that they were actually really talented individuals, and yes, they were also propagandists, but they were also kind of local artists and local media producers, because there was also no television at the time. So especially the lantern slides and the clapper talks, or the lecturing that was taking place during film projection or between film projection or before were as important as the films that were being projected.
And you write too that some projectionists would produce the slides themselves, right? So they had some autonomy over the content. So then you have these people that are working as projectionists, and they have a lot of work for them, right? Carrying these heavy equipment, as you're suggesting, spending long times, I guess, in these remote villages, so away from their homes. What would lead someone to become a projectionist? What's the draw in a profession like that?
Yeah, so film was part of it's still seen very much as a sort of a symbolic of modernity, and working with advanced technology was something to aspire towards for many projectionists. Many of them were recruited from school teachers, or sometimes demilitarized officers, and also some of them were I think that for many, the mobility of the job, and also there's certain prestige that comes with it, right? There are different kinds of motivations for people. In the Cultural Revolution, so for example, the family friend projectionist said that he got the best meals because villagers really wanted them to come, and the projectionists are extremely popular. So there is a lot of work, but it also seemed very rewarding for the people who took it on. And then there's also a possibility to rise through the ranks for the initial generations of mobile projectionists, right? So they would be going, be like roving projectionists for the first 2 years or so, and then they can train other projectionists, and they would be in maybe teaching or repairing machinery. So there are different, it's kind of like they were actually rising through the bureaucracy as well. So not too many people were actually mobile projectionists for many, many years.
Right. And I teased this a little bit too, and not everybody had access to becoming a projectionist, right? You spent some time writing about how that was particularly challenging for women to perform as projectionists, unlike this one that we see in the cover. So can you tell us a little about what are the challenges for women, or the impediments for women to rise to that position? Yeah.
Yeah, so when I was first looking through the material, the historical publications on film projection, it did strike me that many of them were female projectionists or
Mhm.
even all female projection teams. And then a lot of these articles were about how they overcame all kinds of hurdles in the for example, like the public, especially the villagers, didn't necessarily think women can do such a
Mm.
job that's meant for men, and also appearing in public was not something that
Mm.
women who were not unmarried should be doing. So there were various forms of hurdles, also carrying heavy machinery. But when I saw all those historical materials about female projections, I thought there would be a large presence of them. And when I actually went into I went into the countryside, and during my field work, I found it was actually very difficult to find any female projectionists.
Mm.
So I think, and then many projectionists explain that it is very difficult for women to find accommodation in the countryside that was secure, and also because of the physical requirements of the job. One female projectionist I did interview talked about how she had to pass a physical exam of like climbing up on a pole to hang like a loudspeaker,
Uh-huh.
basically. So that was part of the entrance exam, and she was one of the few women who was able to
Mm.
pass that test in a way. So in reality, they were a very small percentage of the number of projectionists. But I did, so one chapter of the book actually focuses on a nationally renowned all-female projection team called the Three Sisters movie team. There was so much press about them, and also even propaganda posters, and there was
Mm.
a documentary newsreel about them, taking their equipment through a fording like a stream, and going into the mountains to show films. So I found that there's so much report, and I was hoping to be able to find them. So my research assistants and I made a trip to Hebei, where these three women were supposedly, showing the films. And what I found surprised me quite a bit, because it turned out that the so-called Three Sisters movie team actually consisted of many people, not just the three women, but also
Mhm.
of many men who were actually supporting them. So including making the slideshows that they had projected. So even though like the newsreel actually showed them painting slides, they didn't actually paint their own slides. They were performers of the slides. And even though the press pictures were showing how they were going into the mountains and bringing cinema into the most remote villages, in reality, they were actually responsible for only the local, the county seat, and I guess the most urban part of the county. And they didn't ever have to climb mountains, but for the purposes actually of propaganda, of creating this image of heroic projectionists and propagandists bringing cinema to the most remote countryside, and also to promote a sense of, like, I guess, gender equality, that women can do what men can do. They were actually there's a lot of constructedness to the way that they were represented in the end. But they were virtuoso performers in a way, right? In the
Mhm.
sense that they were doing amazing bamboo clapper talks and projecting these slideshows. That's what they were most famous for, even animating the slideshows. But it did make me aware that what was represented in the source materials that I had, in the textual materials, and what was happening on the ground could be starkly different. And that there was a real effort to recruit female projectionists, also because they were able to access women. So I would have to say
Mm.
that there was inequality of access to not only to becoming projectionists, but also to cinema more generally. Like, who were the audiences for cinema in the socialist period? This varied a great deal, but in fact, young men were the ones who were going to many more films than, say, women. And then also cadres who were like village leaders, they had many more opportunity to watch films. Soldiers, workers, people who went to construction sites to do physical labor were audiences much more so than just ordinary villagers, right? So my background image is a much more idealized vision of the film audience, because women were actually also the minority of movie audiences.
I'm glad you brought up the Three Sisters movie team, because I love that chapter. Not just because of the story that it is telling or that these images are telling, but because you take time to show us that you're reading these images against the grain, right? And the importance of not taking these, I guess, propaganda messages at face value. And another example is the background image that you have there. So it illustrates really well the challenges of this kind of research work that you're doing. But I wanted to hear you say a little bit about the films themselves before we get to the audience, because that's also a fascinating topic. Not all films were allowed to be screened, right? Like, so, and I think you talked about soldiers and young men being privileged as having access to these screenings. I assume that those films also spoke directly to them, more so than to the children that are watching the Heroic Little Guerrillas, for example, right? So tell us a little bit about these films.
So the genre, among the book's title, Cinematic Guerillas, does come from the fact that many of the films that were being screened in Socialist China were guerrilla war films portraying guerrillas as heroes. And so that's actually one of the major genres of like war films that had a huge impact also on audiences. But because guerrilla war film, so I'll give maybe one example of a film that was watched so many times by, it was documented some 2.1 billion viewings, is a film called Tunnel Warfare. And it was made in 1965 by August 1st Film Studio, which is actually making like films in the genre called military pedagogical films. This was a time of huge geopolitical tensions, and there was a fear of maybe like even war with the Soviet Union. And so a lot, in a way, like a lot of these guerrilla war films were also preparing the Chinese population for possible warfare. And how are you going to fight back? And with very maybe possibly very low tech means. So they were, so this film was in some ways sort of talking about how to dig tunnels and as a, like almost like bunkers everywhere in order to create an opportunity for survival, I guess, like in the case of even nuclear disasters. So, and by the time, so this film was released in 1965, but it was shown repeatedly throughout the Cultural Revolution decade. And it was actually like one of the people's favorite films. And it also had an impact on the digging of tunnels and digging of bunkers, nuclear bunkers in the at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, there was sort of a nationwide campaign to dig bunkers. And so people actually took the techniques that were introduced in this kind of tunnel warfare film as a way of how to, create their own bunkers. So it was, so these films actually had very tangible impact. But another kind of genre that was a subgenre of guerrilla war films was kind of a spy thriller films. And so it made everybody very vigilant about catching spies in their lives. And so it also had an impact on kind of the mass surveillance over each other, right? And yet the villains in some of these films were very attractive to audience as well, especially some female spies were actually became the idols of a generation. They, they were dancing rumba. They were they were enjoying their bourgeois lifestyle. So audiences actually sometimes identified more with the villains of these films than with the heroes, whom they found almost a little bit boring, right? So this is also what I mean by audiences as guerrillas who were having potentially sort of subversive interpretations or alternative strategies of identification with these films than the way they were originally intended. So I find to be quite interesting as well to ask about how people were watching these films and were they actually accepting the most obvious messages of these films, or perhaps they were reading them subversively precisely because they were also watching them repeatedly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Sorry, Bruno,
those.
to interrupt. I'm just going to jump in for a second. For one, I think that's really fascinating. I'd love to hear you speak more about these sort of oppositional readings and how you became aware of that. But I realized I forgot to add at the beginning that we will be opening the conversation for questions in about 10 minutes. So in the meantime, you can feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that. And I just want to assure the audience that we will be making time to hear from you. So please continue. Sorry for the interruption.
Thank you, Rebecca. You were talking about the tunnel warfare, and how it becomes clear through your account that these films are the goal of these films is really emulation, right? To have audiences learn how to behave in certain ways, and to go back to what Rebecca mentioned, like the oppositional reading of these films also went through incorporating a particular form of watching, right? That they knew how to behave within the screening, because they knew how to emulate that kind of performance or ritual of watching film. I don't know where I'm going with this. I guess it was you already explained like how dissent was possible, right? And what did it mean? But along those lines, you have some anecdotes about audiences in the screen. So how did they behave? Talked a little bit about how their makeup was not as heterogeneous as these images suggest. But you also talk about audience members perhaps being punished for misbehaving, or a stampede, right? There are some instances of film screenings gone awry. So could you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, so yeah, they're actually, I was reading through all these film gazetteers. So one of the sources that I had were these local film histories that had been published by every province, somehow compiled during the 1990s and early 2000s. And they had various instances that, and I was actually very struck by the number of accidents that happened in association with these open air screenings that were sometimes sort of set up in a rather ad hoc way, so that they were next to rivers. And then when there are too many people who come, some fall into the water. And then there are also cases of like, they try to restrict admission by, having a film screening within within some kind of walls, and only some people were allowed to go in, but more people wanted to go in. So because film was still like a highly, especially certain what I'm calling like village buster films, in some ways, films that were in high demand. And sometimes the films were only meant for soldiers, but the local population also wanted to watch them. And so those actually led to certain kinds of accidents. But I think there are also other ways where films are interpreted differently from the way they were intended, but audiences still had to perform the correct type of response. So I think one of the most, the sites of, I guess like audience response with tears might be the best example of like being really moved by a film or so. There were many films that were showing the oppression of old society and old China, and how revolution was able to transform people's lives. And audiences were actually supposed to show their sympathy with the protagonists of the films, and by shedding tears. But one example I give is from a film portraying Tibet made in 1963 called Surf. And that there's an account from historian Tsarin Shakia who mentioned how everybody in Lhasa in Tibet had to go watch this film, which is sort of showing how terrible life in Tibet supposedly was before the communists came. And they were also really supposed to shed tears, but he said that his mother and her friends put tiger balm under their eyes to make them water, to make the eyes water in order, because they actually could not identify with the film's protagonist at all. And there's a scene where the so-called serf, this poor boy who was going to who lost his parents, was orphaned, and all because of the oppression of the landlords and so on. He was so hungry at some point that he stole food from the altar in a temple and because of this, actually many Tibetan audiences at the time, they renamed the film and called it Altar Thief. So they felt he shouldn't have done that. It was an act of sacrilege, but that's not something that they can say outright, right? So what happens is that they will actually perform the correct types of response. And another instance of tears that I would give is that after Mao's death, there was a funeral of Mao's death, that was made into a documentary. And this film was screened around the country also as a way to commemorate the great leader and everybody was also supposed to cry at this film. And if you didn't cry, it was not going to be correct. So yeah, and then so I heard about one instance in a Zhejiang village where somebody actually laughed when they showed this film. And so the projectionists got very nervous and was going to, try to ask who had laughed and persecute the person who had laughed. But somehow the other audience members are protected. Nobody denounced it. Sort of, they actually prevented this instance from turning into a sort of a mass denunciation or some kind of persecution. So yeah, so that was also a very interesting instance where you can only hear from the various accounts of moviegoing how audiences had extremely complex reactions to the films that were being screened.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You also mentioned something that you call criticism screenings that were available to party leaders or people in the higher echelons of power rather than the common people. And I'm curious if you could explain what they were and who had access to them, but also how they helped disseminate, Maoist views and ideology rather than what's being criticized, I guess, right? And what are the risks involved in showing films of the kinds of criticism? Criticism screenings, right?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, I think that because so part of a number of films we know that were made in the 17 years before the Cultural Revolution are said to be banned. And so for one example would be Xie Jing's Two Stage Sisters. And then there's some other examples. And so I for a long time, I thought these films were never seen. But as I learned through actually a lot of these local film histories is that there were like dozens of films that were supposedly criticized as poisonous weeds, as films that were like, actually a lot of them personally by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, that these films were actually widely seen by, tens of millions of audiences, mostly in urban areas, because there was actually a directive directly from Mao since 1965 that certain criticized films or poisonous weeds should be exposed to the public, that they should, so that it can sort of increase the audience's intellectual immunity. There's even a kind of vaccination discourse to this. I was working on this during the pandemic, so I did somehow was really struck by this idea of like, exposing films to the public so that they can, gain a certain immunity to them, to the bad ideas in them. But again, I don't know, maybe to continue with our earlier discussion of tiers at cinema. So there was the Xie Jing film, Two Stage Sisters, is a very moving melodrama. And but it was criticized by the officials of the Cultural Revolution at the time, particularly Jiang Qing. And so when they staged a criticism screening of the film, oftentimes criticism screenings also has a denunciation. So there's a voiceover that actually, a live voiceover that actually denounces the films at the same time as they're being screened. So after, or there would be a criticism of the film afterwards. So the idea is that workers of this cotton factory were supposed to watch this film and then criticize it together afterwards. And they were even told to fold their arms around, around their shoulders so that they can't be moved. But then at the end of the film, many people were in tears because they really identified with the protagonist of the film, and so they couldn't help but shed tears. And then so so these films actually had the opposite effects, or the criticism screening had the opposite effects of they still infected the audience in many ways, right? So there were many other examples of films that were being criticized, but in fact, audiences tried their best to sneak into as many of such screenings as possible. And for some audience members, the Cultural Revolution even became like an age of enlightenment because they got to see these really incredibly wonderful films. A related kind of screening was called so-called internal reference screenings, often of foreign films that were also being criticized, but everybody going to these films were they were interested in watching the films rather than the criticism part.
And I'm going to jump in here because we've been getting quite a few questions, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to them all. So first, from Maureen Turim, we have a question. Were you able to research the difference in various regional reception of the films? And that actually relates to another question that came into the chat that is about, just curious where you did your field work for this book. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, indeed. So the field work was done primarily in two different prefectures of Zhejiang province, as well as in Hubei province, also two different prefectures, and also in Hebei. I also went to Northeast, but those were, I think I went there when it was too cold, so I couldn't really find any open air projections at that time. So that was less. So in terms of the actual projectionists I interviewed, most of them were from 3 provinces. And then, but the materials that I consulted in terms of all these local histories and also magazines, there would be a total of about like 20 different provinces were covered, and there were indeed a huge regional differences. Oh, actually, like I also had really the fortune of having a research assistant who helped me do interviews in Ningxia. So this is a very different experience as well in a mostly a Muslim region. So I thought, so I did hear a lot of, or I did find many differences between their accounts of both in terms of like what films they like to watch. So for example, Jiang Qing's revolutionary model operas, a lot of them were Peking opera. And these were much more popular in northern areas than in the south, when they couldn't really understand that kind of regional opera. And earlier I gave the example of like that, a film about Tibet, and its Tibetan reception is very different, of course, from other places.
Right. Well, I'm just going to jump down because another question is sort of ties into this one, in that this is from Yi Lu, who is interested actually more specifically, well, in 2 things: how you work, how you collaborated with graduate students, and then also how your field research influenced your archival research.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that this whole project, in some ways, it took so long, but it also was really worthwhile because I wanted to do field research, right? To do more and more field work. And I was really fortunate. So apart from like family connections and the initial interviews that I did, I was very fortunate to be able to collaborate with history professor and his many graduate students at the East China Normal University, Professor Feng Xiaocai. And because they were actually already going to many of these places, to get, they were doing other types of oral histories, and also more focused on economic histories. Professor Feng was actually writing a whole history of a certain prefecture in Zhejiang province, and there were other students who were interested in going to do their own research, actually, like, about Christianity, about electricity, about, so they all had that different kinds of research projects. So in a way, we were allies together when we went to the countryside, and we all had our own questions to ask. But I was very inspired actually by some of the questions that they had asked because, so for example, the whole economics chapter, I had a whole chapter. I would know it wouldn't have really occurred to me to ask so many questions about what movies cost if it hadn't been because of the economic historians in this research team. Yeah, so I'm really grateful for that whole process, and yeah, so that really affected the directions that this book has taken.
Yeah, great. Okay, we have a question here from Emily Wilcox, thanking you for the stimulating conversation. Film projectionists and open-air cinema have become a popular subject with growing interest in Chinese film and media studies. How does your book engage with this broader existing scholarship? I'm thinking, for example, of Chen Shu Zhao's book, Cinema Off-Screen, as well as others. And I have to apologize. I know I'm garbling all the pronunciations, but Cinema Off-Screen is the book title.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. Yes, I think I was really happy to see Chen Shu's like actually I think earlier as I was like writing up this book project, I saw an article that Chen Shu had published about the projectionist already, and then I also exchanged we had exchanged manuscripts before her book has come out. So I think that maybe one, so I do discuss this sort of how my book builds on cinema off screen in the introduction. But I think that maybe one big difference is that cinema off screen takes a much more nostalgic approach to movie going in socialist China. And I'm more interested actually in the way that cinema contributed to nation building, to making revolution, to mobilizing of the people, and also a focus on ethnographic field work of actually talking to many more projectionists about their experiences of showing films, as well as I think the economic story, the gender story, and then also encompass sort of trying to have a very wide variety of stories that are from different parts of China was part of my goal. And that's something that I wanted to work on more over time. So, and also maybe differentiating a lot between the different time periods. I feel like this, it was, but it was really helpful to, I think, to have multiple, interests. I see this actually in recent scholarship, but also student papers about the period, socialist period. It used to be a kind of a missing period in the scholarship of Chinese cinema. Everyone's sort of focused much more on the Republican era before 1949, or in the, from the 1980s onwards, the fifth generation and contemporary Chinese cinema. And there wasn't a lot of scholarship on socialist cinema at all. And so I'm really glad to see this sort of surge of interest. And I think that yeah, I'm hoping that more can be done. Also, there are so many aspects that I feel that neither Chen Shu nor I have a touchdown in our books that others could also, develop further in their future scholarship. Thanks.
Great. Okay, we have two questions from Joshua Malitsky. He's asking, can you talk about the ratios between nonfiction film and fiction film in these programs? And is there any evidence about different audience responses to nonfiction versus fiction? Then related to this, have you had an opportunity to screen these films for current audiences? Have there been any surprising responses? One of the reasons I ask is because I've worked on revolutionary nonfiction film projects in various countries, and it's amazing how moved even some of the most cynical folks are by the accomplishments of citizens at the time, especially moved by the labor.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I think I did notice that documentary films were, especially like short documentary, sometimes they were more documentary newsreels, but they were also so-called science education films. There is actually a forthcoming book from Columbia University Press on Chinese documentaries over 1 century by Ying Qian. Called Revolutionary Becoming. So I would highly recommend that book on the documentary side. But in my own research, I did notice that I guess there are many ways of addressing this question. It's just like during the Great Leap Forward is when documentaries became highlighted. So around 1958 or so, in terms of for screening. And these documentaries were oftentimes almost like projections of the future. So in a way, in the tractor film that's in my background image, this particular image was made in 1956, and many documentaries from the Soviet Union were being screened at the time about collective farming and about the wonders of technology such as tractors. And these films were meant to convince the audience about collectivization so that they will join communes or collectives, right? So I think documentaries actually had a greater impact on how audiences were supposed to conform to state policy or follow the recommendations of the state, because they were often like rallying the audiences as well in whether it's a class struggle or joining the collective and so on, sort of showcasing the future, showcasing. In fact, in the 1950s, cinema was called socialist distant horizon education, in a way to sort of showing what the future might look like. So fictional films sometimes overlapped a little bit with documentaries in the sense that, like the aforementioned Tunnel Warfare, also it's a fictional film, but it's based on historical experiences, and it had an impact on how audiences were going to be digging bunkers, for example. So I don't know if that answers all the various dimensions of the question, but maybe, yeah, in the interest of time, I think.
Yeah, we do have quite a few more questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but from Alyssa Elegant, can you discuss the form mobility took? Was it pedestrian, horseback, motor vehicle, train? Did projectionists sometimes use multiple modes?
Yes, thank you. Yes, all of the above, actually. I think trains less so. Trains were used more to transport film prints. But projectionists were based primarily at the level of the county. So there would not really be trains within the county, but then depending on whatever modes of transportation were possible within the circuit that they were traveling, they would be using, I actually heard people using like horse carriages quite a bit. Every projection team often also had a bicycle that was used to not to transport the bigger pieces of machineries, but rather to just to take the film prints around. That was much more common, yeah.
Okay, here's a question from Elena Razlogova about translation. Did projectionists ever have to translate film dialogues made in one part of China for Chinese audiences in other parts of the country?
Yeah, thank you so much, Elaine. Yes, they did. So actually, one of the main reasons why they're holding microphones or, talking during the films is to translate for audiences who didn't necessarily understand Mandarin. Most of the films are spoken in Mandarin. So there was a lot of sort of live dubbing of these films. And in the 1950s, I think there was even like a time when they tried to add a soundtrack to these films, even using like local technology and recording a fully dubbed version, especially in the Korean-speaking area of Northeast China.
Mm-hmm.
And some films were international as well, right? That needed translation.
Oh, so the international films had already been dubbed into Mandarin.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's see what else we can get through here. From Anne Zhang, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Sort of a follow-up to the fieldwork question. How was the writing experience of incorporating these anthropological findings with the theorization of the materials? And how was the experience of doing research in various archives when thinking about the question of access in the Chinese context?
Yeah, I think I was very lucky to be able to access a lot of, I actually ended up using materials that can actually be easily purchased on old book websites, but I was able to access various local archives, in part thanks to working with Chinese collaborators. And in some the places we actually chose to go were places that were familiar to many graduate students who were helping me. So they were like kind of going to their hometown areas and they spoke the local dialect. So it was easier to access the local people as well as the local archives. Yeah, and how to incorporate, I feel that it's more the more like ethnographic findings or oral history findings really challenged many of the prior theories that I was working with. So, like I had this whole introduction part of, asking these very larger questions about like, what is cinema? I also want to add who is cinema? But I realized that the question, what is cinema, can be posed not only to scholars and to us who study films, but also to audiences. And they came up with really interesting answers and that are worthy of further theorization, right? I mean, so I felt that, so when someone, this is sort of my when a collaborator, Feng Xiaocai, he said, oh, it was our own, cinema was our only nightlife that was possible. And then many audiences members did say it was in the Chinese term 热闹, which I very literally translate as hot noise. It was also another key term that I felt was worthy of theorization. Even though by that they meant that it was something, cinema was something that we didn't really pay attention to. It was more the everything around the cinema, the event of cinema.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I am so sorry that we have to end here. We didn't manage to get to all the questions, but I think this was a really stimulating and productive conversation, very enjoyable. We're just posting into the chat that Columbia University Press has a 20% discount with the code that we have put into the chat. So for those of you who want to get your own copies of this book, you may want to take that down. And I'll sign off by saying thank you so much to everybody for coming, and huge thanks to you, Bruno, for your great selection, and thank you to Jie Li for this really wonderful, wonderful research and conversation. So have a good weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.